Three people, three disappearances, three mysteries tangled into one impossible story. A baby stolen from a hospital in broad daylight. A toddler abandoned in a parking lot. A twin sister who vanished without a trace. For 55 years, these three lives remained lost in the shadows, their stories twisted together by lies, confusion, and desperate hope. One man spent decades searching for the truth about who he really was, and what he discovered didn't just solve one mystery, it revealed three. This is the story of identities stolen, families shattered, and the relentless search for answers that uncovered one of the most shocking cases in American history. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from, because this story will surprise you from beginning to end. April 26, 1964. Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. Dora and Chester Fronczak had just welcomed their son into the world. They named him Paul Joseph Fronczak. He was healthy, perfect, and everything they had dreamed of after years of trying to conceive. Dora held her newborn baby that first day, counting his tiny fingers, memorizing the curve of his ears, the softness of his skin. She was exhausted but blissfully happy. Her son was finally here, but that happiness would last less than 24 hours. The next morning, April 27th, a woman walked into Dora's hospital room. She wore a crisp white nurse's uniform. Her hair was neatly pinned back. She carried herself with professional confidence that made her blend seamlessly into the busy hospital environment. She smiled at Dora and told her that the doctor needed to examine baby Paul. It was routine, she explained. Nothing to worry about. Dora, tired from labor and trusting the hospital staff completely, handed her newborn son to the woman in white. She watched as the woman cradled Paul in her arms and walked out of the room. Dora had no way of knowing she would never see her real son again. Minutes passed, then an hour, then more. Dora began to feel uneasy. Where was her baby? Why was the examination taking so long? When a different nurse came into the room, Dora asked about Paul. The nurse looked confused. What examination? There was no examination scheduled for the Fronczak baby. Panic erupted like a bomb going off. The hospital staff searched frantically. Security was called. Police descended on the building. But baby Paul was gone. And so was the woman in the white uniform. She had simply walked into one of the busiest hospitals in Chicago, taken a one-day-old infant from his mother's arms, and disappeared into the city like smoke dissolving into air. The investigation that followed became the largest manhunt in Chicago history up to that point. The FBI joined immediately. 200 police officers went door to door throughout the city. 175,000 postal workers were given flyers with information about the missing baby. 600 homes were searched by midnight on the first day alone. The story dominated newspapers across the country. Everyone knew about baby Paul Fronczak. Everyone was looking for him. The police had very little to go on. Blood type and ear shape were about the only identifying features of a one-day-old infant. They had a sketch of the woman in white, but hundreds of tips led nowhere. She had been meticulous. She had planned this carefully, and she had vanished completely. Dora and Chester's world collapsed. The nursery they had prepared sat empty. The baby clothes remained unworn. Every day without answers was agony. Dora fell into a deep depression, barely able to function. Chester tried to stay strong, but the weight of grief was crushing them both. Months turned into a year. The leads dried up. The trail went cold. The FBI continued to investigate, but hope was fading. 10,000 babies were examined and tested across the country by 1966 to see if any of them might be Paul. None matched. The Fronczaks began to accept the unbearable truth that they might never see their son again. Then, on July 2, 1965, something happened that seemed like a miracle. A small boy, approximately 1 year old, was found abandoned in a stroller outside a department store in Newark, New Jersey. He had been left in a busy shopping center parking lot. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody came forward to claim him. The child was placed into foster care and given the name Scott McKinley. But when FBI agents looked at photos of the boy and compared them to the missing Paul Fronczak, They noticed similarities: the shape of the ears, the approximate age. Could this be the baby who had been stolen from Chicago? The FBI contacted Dora and Chester. They brought the boy to Chicago for the couple to see. DNA testing didn't exist yet. Blood type matching was inconclusive because millions of people shared the same types. The only thing they could really rely on was the shape of the child's ears, which at the time was thought to be as unique as a fingerprint, and the ears seemed to match. More importantly, Dora and Chester desperately wanted this to be their son. They needed it to be true. When they looked at the toddler, they saw what they wanted to see. They said, "Yes, this is our Paul." The boy was returned to them. The case was officially closed. Everyone wanted a happy ending, so they created one. The newspapers celebrated the reunion. The FBI moved on to other cases. The Fronczaks took their son home and tried to build the life that had been stolen from them. But it was all built on a foundation of hope rather than truth. And that foundation would eventually crumble. The boy who came home to the Fronczaks grew up as Paul Joseph Fronczak. Dora and Chester loved him. They raised him as their son, and for all practical purposes, he was their son. But the shadow of the kidnapping followed him his entire life. The story was too big, too public to hide. Everyone in the family knew about it. Neighbors knew about it. As Paul grew older, his parents told him the truth about what had happened when he was a baby. They told him he had been kidnapped and found. They told him he was their miracle child, returned to them against all odds. But when Paul was 10 years old, something happened that planted seeds of doubt that would grow for the next 4 decades. He was snooping in the crawl space of their home, looking for hidden Christmas presents like any curious kid would do. Instead of presents, he found a box. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, dozens of them. He pulled them out and started reading. The headlines screamed across the pages. "Baby stolen from hospital. Mother pleads, please return my son. FBI searches for missing infant." There were photos of his mother crying, photos of police searching, photos of the woman in white who had taken him, and then more clippings from a year later. Missing baby found. Fronczak family reunited. Lost son returns home. Paul brought the clippings to his mother. Instead of explaining, Dora scolded him. She told him yes, he had been kidnapped. Yes, they had found him. They loved him. And that was all he needed to know. The subject was closed. But for Paul, it wasn't closed at all. It had just been ripped wide open. From that moment forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He looked at family photos and felt like he was looking at someone else's life. He studied his features in the mirror and compared them to his parents. He didn't look like them. But then again, many children don't resemble their parents perfectly. It didn't mean anything. Did it? Throughout his teenage years and into adulthood, the questions lingered in the back of Paul's mind, but he pushed them down. He had a good life. His parents loved him. His younger brother was born after he came into the family, and they were close. Why would he ruin that with doubts and questions that might hurt everyone? What if he was wrong? What if the FBI had been right and he really was Paul Fronczak? The uncertainty paralyzed him, so he lived his life, got married, had a daughter of his own, and tried to forget the nagging feeling that he didn't know who he really was. But becoming a father changed something in Paul. Looking at his own daughter, he understood the primal connection between parent and child. He thought about what his biological parents must have felt when they realized he was missing. And he thought about Dora and Chester, who had lost their real son and spent their entire lives believing they had him back. The weight of all those unanswered questions became too heavy to carry. In 2012, at the age of 48, Paul decided he needed to know the truth. He bought an over-the-counter DNA test kit. The next time his parents visited him in Las Vegas where he was living, he asked them a question that would change everything. "Have you ever wondered if I'm your real son?" His parents were shocked. They reluctantly agreed to take the DNA test with him. But after the visit ended and Paul returned to his home in Nevada, his parents called him. They had changed their minds. They didn't want him to send in the DNA samples. They were scared of what the results might reveal. Paul faced an impossible choice. He could respect their wishes and live the rest of his life never knowing the truth. Or he could go against them and potentially destroy the family he loved. After struggling with the decision, he made his choice. He sent in the DNA samples. Then he waited. When the results arrived, they confirmed what some part of him had always suspected deep down. He was not biologically related to Dora and Chester Fronczak. The boy they had raised, the boy they had loved as their son for 48 years, was not their son. The FBI had been wrong. The reunion that had been celebrated in newspapers across the country had been a mistake. Paul Fronczak wasn't Paul Fronczak at all. His entire identity was a lie. Everything he thought he knew about himself, his history, his origins, had been built on a foundation of false hope and mistaken identity. But if he wasn't Paul, then who was he? And where was the real Paul Fronczak? Those two questions would consume the next 7 years of his life and uncover a mystery far more complex than anyone had imagined. The DNA results devastated Paul, but they also liberated him. For the first time in his life, he had concrete proof that his doubts had been valid. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't being disloyal to his family. He genuinely wasn't who everyone had told him he was. Now he could search for the truth without guilt. But where would he even begin? He decided to go public with his story. In 2013, he contacted the media. His case exploded across national news. He appeared on television shows and spoke to newspapers. He wanted the world to know that the Paul Fronczak case had never actually been solved. The baby found in Newark had been a different child entirely. The real Paul was still missing. The response was overwhelming. Tips poured in from across the country. People who had their own questions about their identities reached out. Adoptees with mysterious backgrounds contacted him. Families with secrets started coming forward. Paul knew he needed expert help to sort through everything. He reached out to Cece Moore, one of the world's leading genetic genealogists. Cece had pioneered the use of DNA databases and genealogical research to solve cold cases and help people find their biological families. She agreed to help Paul discover his true identity. It would be one of the most complex cases she had ever tackled. Paul uploaded his DNA to multiple genealogy databases. The results started coming back with matches to distant relatives, but nobody close enough to immediately identify who he was. Cece and her team of volunteer genealogists began the painstaking process of building family trees. They worked backwards from the DNA matches, following branches and connections, trying to narrow down where Paul fit into the puzzle. They cross-referenced birth records, census data, obituaries, and any other historical documents they could find. It was like assembling a massive jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box to guide them. In 2015, after years of intensive work, Cece and her team made the breakthrough. They had identified Paul's biological family. His real name was Jack Rosenthal. He had been born on October 27, 1963, not April 26, 1964. He was actually older than Paul Fronczak would have been. His biological parents were Gilbert and Marie Rosenthal, both of whom had died in the 1990s from cancer. Paul, who was now Jack, began reaching out to his biological relatives. He discovered he had older siblings, but when he tried to contact them, they refused to speak with him. They didn't want to dredge up the past. The rejection stung, but Jack pressed forward. He needed to understand how he had ended up abandoned in that parking lot in Newark. What he learned about his biological family was disturbing. Jack discovered that his parents, Gilbert and Marie, had been troubled people. Gilbert had returned from the Korean War with violent tendencies. Marie struggled with alcoholism. Family members told Jack that he and his siblings had been abused and neglected. But there was something else. Something that made the story even more tragic and complex. Jack hadn't been an only child in his biological family. He had been a twin. His twin sister's name was Jill Rosenthal, and Jill had disappeared around the same time that Jack was found abandoned in Newark. She was never seen again. The revelation that he had a twin sister who was still missing hit Jack like a freight train. Not only had he spent his entire life not knowing who he really was, but he had a sister out there somewhere. Was she alive? Was she dead? Had she been abandoned somewhere else like he had been? Or had something worse happened to her? Jack began interviewing people who had known his biological parents. The picture that emerged was grim. Witnesses told him that both he and Jill had been abused as small children. One woman remembered visiting the Rosenthal home and finding the twins crying and neglected, while Gilbert and Marie partied and drank. The next morning, when she came back to check on the children, she was yelled at for interfering. Jack developed a theory about what might have happened. He believes that something tragic occurred with Jill, possibly an accident or something worse, while the twins were being abused and neglected. Unable to explain what happened to one twin, Gilbert and Marie decided to get rid of both children. That would explain why Jack was abandoned in Newark around the same time Jill disappeared. The thought that his twin sister might have been killed by their biological parents haunts Jack to this day. But he also holds on to hope that maybe Jill survived. Maybe she was abandoned somewhere else like he was and raised under a different name, not knowing her true identity. The search for Jill became Jack's new obsession. But he still had another mission. He needed to find the real Paul Fronczak. Because somewhere out there, the baby who had been kidnapped from Michael Reese Hospital in 1964 was still missing. And Dora and Chester deserved to know what happened to their son, even if they would never live to meet him. Jack threw himself into finding the real Paul Fronczak, with the same intensity he had used to discover his own identity. He worked closely with the FBI, which had officially reopened the case after his DNA results proved the original reunion had been a mistake. He collaborated with Cece Moore and her team again. He appeared on television shows and gave interviews, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. He studied every detail of the original kidnapping. Who was the woman in white? Why had she taken baby Paul? Where had she gone? One theory was that the kidnapper had been part of a black market baby ring that operated in the 1960s. These illegal adoption operations were more common than most people realized before modern regulations and DNA testing. They would take babies from hospitals or buy them from desperate mothers, then sell them to couples who wanted children but couldn't adopt legally. If this was the case, the real Paul might have been sold to a family that raised him as their biological child, never knowing he had been stolen. That family would have believed they were participating in a legitimate private adoption. The child would have grown up happy and loved, completely unaware of his true origins. Another theory suggested the kidnapper was a woman who had lost her own baby or was unable to have children and acted alone out of desperate grief. In the 1960s, there was enormous social pressure on women to become mothers. Infertility was treated as a shameful personal failure. Some women, driven to extremes by loss and societal expectations, kidnapped babies to fulfill that role. If this was true, the kidnapper might have raised Paul herself, probably moving to a different city or state to avoid detection. She would have told everyone he was her biological child, and Paul would have had no reason to doubt her. Jack knew that the key to finding Paul was the same technology that had helped him discover his own identity: genetic genealogy. Somewhere out there, the real Paul might have children or grandchildren. If any of them uploaded their DNA to a genealogy database, it could create a match that would lead back to Paul. Jack encouraged everyone watching his story to take DNA tests and upload their results. He explained that you never know what secrets might be hiding in your family tree. His message resonated with millions of people. DNA testing became increasingly popular, and databases grew exponentially. Then, in late 2018 or early 2019, the breakthrough finally came. A tip came through Paul's Facebook page where he had been sharing updates about his search. Someone mentioned a man living in rural Michigan who might be the real Paul Fronczak. The man's name was Kevin Baty, and he was in his mid-50s. He had lived in the Chicago area for the first 10 years of his life before his family moved to Michigan. There were questions about his birth circumstances that he had never been able to fully answer. One of Kevin's adult daughters had submitted her DNA to a genealogy website. When Cece Moore analyzed the DNA data, she found connections between Kevin's daughter and the Fronczak family. The evidence pointed to one conclusion: Kevin Baty was the baby who had been stolen from Michael Reese Hospital on April 27, 1964. The FBI confirmed it. After 55 years, the real Paul Fronczak had been found. He was alive. He had grown up in Michigan under a completely different name, never knowing that he had been kidnapped as an infant, never knowing that somewhere in Chicago, his biological mother had spent her entire life grieving and wondering what happened to him. The news should have been cause for celebration, but it was complicated. Kevin Baty didn't want media attention. He didn't want to speak publicly about the discovery. He had lived his entire life as Kevin Baty, and that's who he felt he was. The revelation of his true identity was deeply private and personal. Jack respected Kevin's wishes, but he desperately wanted to facilitate a connection between Kevin and Dora Fronczak. Chester had passed away years earlier, never knowing that his real son had been found. But Dora was still alive, though elderly. Jack reached out to both sides. In December 2019, Dora Fronczak spoke with her biological son for the first time in 55 years. Jack was present during the first call, along with his teenage daughter, Emma. They couldn't help but listen. Dora didn't cry during the conversation. She asked Kevin what kind of life he had lived. She wanted to know if he had been happy. The conversation was brief and somewhat awkward. How do you compress 55 years of separation into a phone call? What do you say to the son who was stolen from you, or to the mother you never knew you had? They spoke a second time, but the relationship remained distant. Kevin had been raised by a woman he considered his mother, and even though she hadn't been his biological parent, she was the mother who raised him. She had passed away several years before the discovery. Was she the kidnapper? That question remains unanswered. Kevin never got the chance to ask her, and he may never know the full truth about how he ended up in her care. In 2020, Kevin Ray Baty died of cancer at the age of 56. He had only known his true identity for about a year before his death. The real Paul Fronczak had been found, but he was lost again before most of the world ever learned his name. Dora Fronczak at least got to speak with her biological son before he died, something Chester never had the chance to do. But the reunion was bittersweet, marked more by loss and missed time than by joy. With Kevin Baty's death and the confirmation of his identity as the real Paul Fronczak, one mystery was solved. But two others remained wide open. The woman who kidnapped baby Paul in 1964 was never identified. She has never been arrested. She has never faced justice. If she is still alive, she is now in her 80s or 90s, possibly carrying the secret of what she did to her grave. Why did she take Paul? Was she acting alone, or was she part of a larger operation? Did she raise him herself, or did she give him to someone else? These questions haunt the case like ghosts. The second unsolved mystery is what happened to Jill Rosenthal, Jack's twin sister. Jack, who now goes by the combined name Paul Jack Fronczak but prefers to be called Jack, has dedicated himself to finding her. He believes it's the final piece of the puzzle, the last answer he needs to complete his story. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has taken up Jill's case. Since there are no known photographs of Jill as a child, forensic artists created an age progression image based on photographs of Jack and other family members. The image shows what Jill might look like today if she is still alive. She would be in her late 50s or early 60s now. Jack has pursued every possible lead. He has worked with psychics, though he knows the information they provide is questionable at best. Several have told him that Jill is still alive, and he wants desperately to believe them. He has traveled to locations where his biological parents lived, searching for clues. He visited his biological grandmother's old home in New Jersey, hoping to find evidence of what happened to Jill. He has tested DNA from women who might possibly be Jill, women who have their own questions about their identities and backgrounds. So far, none have been matches. But Jack refuses to give up hope. The theory that haunts Jack is the darkest one. He believes it's possible that Jill died as a result of the abuse and neglect their biological parents inflicted on them. If that's true, Gilbert and Marie may have panicked and hidden her body, then abandoned Jack to avoid suspicion. If this scenario is what actually happened, finding Jill's remains after 60 years would be nearly impossible. But Jack also clings to the alternative possibility. Maybe Jill was abandoned somewhere else, just like he was. Maybe she was found by different people and raised under a different name. Maybe she's out there right now, living a normal life, not knowing she has a twin brother desperately searching for her. Jack's journey has cost him enormously. His marriage ended during his obsessive search for answers. He spent his life savings on investigators, DNA tests, and travel. He devoted years to interviews, research, and following leads that often went nowhere. Some people call him a hero for his dedication to uncovering the truth. Others think he's gone too far, sacrificing too much for people he never even knew. But for Jack, there was never really a choice. Once you know the truth is out there, you can't unknow it. Once you understand that people are missing and families are broken, you can't just walk away. Jack has written 2 books about his experiences. A documentary called The Lost Sons was released in 2021, chronicling his search. He has become an advocate for missing children and for people searching for their biological identities. He speaks at events for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. He helps other adoptees and NPEs, people who discover they are not parent expected, navigate the emotional trauma of learning their identities are not what they thought. His story has inspired thousands of people to take DNA tests and search for their own truths. In May 2023, Jack spoke at the Department of Justice for the 40th Annual National Missing Children's Day. Standing at the podium, he told the audience about his multiple identities. If you look at my birth certificate and driver's license, I'm Paul Joseph Fronczak. If you ask a genetic genealogist, I'm Jack Thomas Rosenthal. For a short time, I was Scott McKinley. He thanked the organizations that helped reunite missing children with their families. He spoke about the importance of never giving up on these cases, no matter how much time has passed, and he pleaded for anyone with information about his twin sister Jill to come forward. The case remains open. The FBI continues to accept tips about the 1964 kidnapping. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children continues to search for Jill Rosenthal. Genetic genealogy continues to advance, offering new possibilities for solving cold cases every day. Jack continues to hope. He knows the odds are against him. He knows that Jill may never be found. But he also knows that his own case seemed impossible to solve. And yet it was solved. The real Paul Fronczak seemed lost forever. And yet he was found. Miracles can happen. Answers can emerge from decades of silence. What makes this story so powerful is what it reveals about identity, family, and truth. Jack lived 48 years as Paul Fronczak before discovering he was Jack Rosenthal. Kevin Baty lived over 50 years not knowing he was Paul Fronczak. Jill Rosenthal, if she's alive, has lived nearly 60 years, possibly not knowing who she really is. How much of who we are is determined by biology, and how much is determined by the life we live? Is Kevin's real identity Paul Fronczak because that's who he was born as, or Kevin Baty because that's who he lived as? These are questions without easy answers. Jack says he's grateful that his biological parents abandoned him, because it led him to the Fronczaks, who loved him and gave him a good life. He says they saved him. At the same time, he grieves for what was lost: his twin sister, his biological identity, the years of confusion and doubt. He's thankful for the journey even though it's cost him everything, because now he knows the truth, and truth, no matter how painful, is better than living a lie. His search continues. Somewhere out there, Jill might be waiting to be found. Somewhere out there, the woman who started this entire chain of events might still be alive, holding the final answers. Until those mysteries are solved, the story of the Paul Fronczak triple disappearance remains unfinished. A reminder that some families are torn apart by secrets, but determination and technology can bring pieces back together, even decades later.